Good morning, quail birds. How are my quail birds? All right, guys and girls, let's get out with the old. I know you're excited. Just wait. Just wait. All right, in with the new. Here's your food. And here's your water. There. Eat, drink, be merry, and produce eggs. I've come to the top of the mountain today to request prayer from you for one very close friend and one very close family member. And for those wise sages among you, I come requesting guidance and wisdom in regard to the most important human being in my life, and that's my son. So my longest running, oldest friend in life, here in just a couple of days, is having hip replacement surgery. He's worried about it. He's been living with a lot of pain. His name's Jonathan. I would like to ask each and every one of you who believe in the power of prayer to please send up a prayer for my friend Jonathan. Pray that his will be done and allow those of us who might have had other plans accept the outcome if things don't go well, but please pray for the best. Also, our Filipino Lolo, it's my wife's grandfather. I call him my grandfather as well. He's in the hospital. He's 88. His wife's 89. You talk about a love story. Theirs is one. Even now, they both probably realistically and in all ways explainable through health and science and medicine should have passed on years ago. But they love each other so much that neither one of them wants to spend a single day on this earth without the other. So they're hanging on for each other. It's a beautiful thing. So please pray for Lolo. Now, in regards to this guidance, I request for my son. He's 13. He's almost 14. And he's asking me questions I don't know how to answer. They're not questions about religion, because we've covered those bases throughout his first 13 years of life. He's starting to ask me questions about God. He's starting to ask me questions about Jesus Christ. This is largely because he's got some friends that are from families of faith who attend services. We don't fall into those ranks. Throughout the years, I've explained to my son the various different religions, what they believe, what the people who follow those religions practice, their thoughts on what is required to enter heaven, the afterlife, on the good side, not the bad side. But as far as he's starting to ask, but which one's right? And that's the question I can't answer. I have no clue. And it's not that I don't believe in a higher power, a mighty spirit. I've just never been smart enough to pick a team. I've never been smart enough to pick sides. And a lot of that has to do with my upbringing. I'm going to share some of that with you very openly here in just a second. But I'm trying not to repeat cycles of toxicity, of ignorance, of abuse, in all ways, shapes, and form of my young son's life. And so far, I'd like to think so good, but I need to come to you with this now. So I really need you to put in the comment section perhaps how you had these conversations with your children, especially, listen, I'm not atheist. And I wouldn't even go as, maybe it's agnostic. I just don't care. I'm going to read to you now something that will help you better understand why I'm in the position I'm in, and maybe help you understand in what ways I need your help to guide my son. So, as I mentioned I would do earlier in the month, and this is actually the second time I've done such here, I'm going to read you a story from my latest release, Utopia Shattered. I've had people ask me before, how does your fiction sound so real? Why does it feel like I'm with you in the story and like these things really happen? And I always answer that question the same way. It's because 90% of the things I write about in these stories actually did happen. And then it's up to you to figure out which 10% of the story is the actual fiction. And typically it's not the part you think. And I'll help you out here in regard to letting you know the religious upbringing background of the omniscient narrator of this story is true. That was me, okay? Bear with me, and I hope you enjoy this. This story is called An Altar Boy's Confession. And I hope you enjoyed this view. I decided to just stop here because we can see the entire property up here. I saw a bumper sticker on a car many years ago that is stuck in my head all these years later because it resonated so well in regard to my take on religion. It read, "Dear Jesus, please protect me from your followers." To date, it's one of my favorites. It ranks right up there with another I agree with that read, "I have no problem with God. It's his fan club that scares the hell out of me." And then, of course, there's the oh-so-witty sticker I saw once that read, "Go forth and consume a satchel full of Richards." Come on, y'all can figure that out. Your sharp tools. That one has nothing to do with religion, of course, but I've stored it away in the back of my mind to use on the members of the fan club should Jesus forget to protect me from them. So, why this problem with religion? Is it because of many of the same reasons so many rational-minded people have issues with religion? Because it's illogical in nature and doesn't even begin to make sense? No. Is it because of the same reasons so many people who just want to see a world at peace despise religion? Because of all the bloodshed, killing, murders, and wars associated with religion? Whether it be certain different sects of people who follow the same religion yet in different ways in various parts of the world, mostly the third world, who have been warring for centuries? No. Is it because of the Bible-beating bubbas in the so-called first world nations who tie themselves to century-old beliefs that have been disproven through time and with science, who would prefer to see mankind give up the hundreds of years worth of knowledge and advancements we've come to enjoy that has made life easier for all of us to appease an invisible sky daddy for whom time and science has yet to shed a minuscule ray of light upon as far as even containing the smallest possibility of existing, at least to any degree that can be measured or proven? No. It is because it doesn't take a rocket, or rather, is it because it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that religion's main fundamental purpose is to control the masses, scare everyone into believing that, hey, even if you get away with that crooked deed, in the end, you'll burn in a fiery pit of hell. And hey, it's a pretty good way to fleece the first 10% of a man's earnings as well. No again. I'll admit that while all these aforementioned reasons to hate religion are understandable to me, they have nothing to do with why I despise religion. I despise religion quite simply because of my childhood. You see, I was raised by parents who should have undoubtedly and unequivocally not been married. Maybe this wasn't the case in the beginning of their marriage. I wasn't there to witness, of course. But certainly by the time their 4 children, of which I was one, were brought into the world, this was indeed the case. My parents obviously hated each other. They rarely spoke to each other, and when they did, it was typically to argue. And not about finances or infidelities, but about anything and everything. They simply had to constantly disagree with each other, and they did so out of spite. At best, they modeled for my 3 sisters and me how not to have a relationship. It's no surprise that all 4 of us have been divorced ourselves, having gone around the first time modeling the toxic, hateful behaviors we saw from our parents. If my father said potato, pronounced potato, my mother would say potato, pronounced potato, and in a really heavy Boston accent because that's where she was from. My father voted Republican, though like everyone else in West by God, Virginia, where I was raised, he was a registered Democrat, and mostly because JFK had rolled through the state back in the 60s and promised everyone he was going to lift all of Appalachia out of poverty, and everyone's still waiting for him to come back from the grave and do it all these years later. So, of course, my mother, yes, a registered Democrat as well, voted Democrat, but not due to loyalty to her party, but rather, and as stated, to spite my father. JFK is surely smiling down on them both. The problem with religion and how I came to form my take on it, at least, started when my father decided he'd had a come-to-Jesus moment one morning after cutting himself while shaving. Somehow, as the blood dripped down his face, it formed, for just a slight instant, the shape of a cross. He would go down and join one of the local Baptist churches shortly thereafter. Like all small towns in Appalachia, part of the Bible Belt, there were dozens of local Baptist churches to choose from. There was the First Baptist Church of whatever river it was that flowed through our town. There was the First Baptist Church of whatever the name of the mountain was that rose over the valley that was our town. There was one First Baptist Church of whatever you wanted to call it for every neighborhood that housed that one guy who knew how Ponzi schemes and federal and state taxation and Social Security and withholding exemptions worked. Since my father had become a Bible-beating Baptist, my mother, of course, had to go out after that and join the local Catholic Church. Had we not lived in such an isolated backwoods area so far from the interstate and any semblance of modern society, where there was at least some diversity or culture other than local culture, I'm sure she would have become Jewish or converted to Islam. But alas, in our part of deep, dark Appalachia, Catholicism was the farthest away one could get from Protestant Christianity and safely live to tell about it. So a Roman Catholic she became. Thus began the religious torment of a child who spent his life trying to please both parents, knowing that if one were being pleased, the other was being shunned, rejected, and offended, leading, of course, to repercussions for said child. The repercussions often consisted of the withholding of necessities such as food, clothing, and shelter, as well as the implementation of a combination of physical, mental, and emotional abuse. Under such conditions, one has a tendency to spend most of one's time outdoors, not because one loves the great outdoors so much, but because one is trying to stay out of sight and out of mind. And all these years later, I've finally come to understand one will end up making a pretty good storyteller because one has got to constantly change one's story to either eat or avoid pain. And the more believable the story, the better one eats and the less pain one experiences. For many years, I would attend the Roman Catholic Church that my mother attended on Saturday evenings for Mass, and then I would attend the Bible-beating Fundamentalist Baptist Church my father attended on Sundays. While getting ready to attend Mass on Saturdays, my father would insist that I was off to listen to a bunch of overeducated snobs who worship the Pope. He would say I'd better never call the priest father because he was not my father, because he was my father, of course. And most of all, I'd better make sure I never let that priest touch me you know where. On Sundays, while getting ready to go to the Baptist church with my father, my mother would go on and on about how I was getting ready to listen to a bunch of inbred redneck hillbillies who quoted the Bible out of context. I'd better not start hanging out with any of those racist homophobes. And no matter what, I'd better make sure I never let any of the gun and Bible-toting bubbas touch me you know where. I look back on it all now and wonder how, in the name of this God my parents always fought over, did I avoid developing a full-blown case of bipolar disorder, if indeed I didn't. This brings me to, perhaps, one of my own experiences with what my father's people might call a come-to-Jesus moment, though it didn't happen while I was shaving. I wasn't old enough to shave yet. It didn't happen in my father's church of choice either while I was listening to how the wages of sin is death and of how Jesus forgives but the good Baptists do not, etc. Nor was it during Mass at my mother's church of choice while listening to the priest sing very much off-key about the instruments of faith. Though this moment didn't come during a Mass, it did happen at my mother's church. And it did involve a couple of gun and Bible-toting bubbas, and I guess what you might call a gun and Bible-toting Betsy, though none of them were from my dad's particular Baptist church. Though I was not making a confession, it happened in the confessional booth, despite the fact that my father, birth father, not priest, let me know I would be disciplined if I ever went to confession, as I was supposed to go to God through Jesus, not a priest in a wooden box. To give more context, I must fill you in on a little more backstory than just my disdain for organized religion and my parents' toxic relationship that I've laid out so far. It was the mid-1980s. Everyone was listening to Madonna, who clearly was not a virgin, singing about what it felt like to be touched as one if she were one. Michael J. Fox was perfectly healthy and traveling in and out of time on the big screen. Women were walking around in leg warmers even when it wasn't cold. And we had a serial killer on the loose in our community. Technically, the term serial killer is being used with liberties here, at least if you were to go by the official record from the time, for you see, there was no official record of what was going on. There had been several accidental deaths, as they were being called in our community, and there had been no evidence of foul play associated with any of these accidental deaths. There were no commonalities among the deaths other than the fact that they were all supposedly accidents to link them together in any way. There was no way to tie any single individual, a suspect or a perpetrator, to them. However, in a small Appalachian American town like ours, 3 seemingly healthy individuals, other than the beer gut, drugs, and crap food diet they all had in common, do not accidentally die in a period of 6 weeks of each other. Also, in a small Appalachian American town like ours, when such things do happen, despite there being no official report tying anything together, people can make connections of their own and people talk. And the talk of the town at the time was that a serial killer was among us. Many nights, while watching Peter Jennings on ABC World News Tonight, we would hear mention of the Green River Killer, a very prolific serial killer on the West Coast, Washington State to be exact, who we'd all later find out was a gun and Bible-toting bubba named Gary Ridgway. Ridgway, it turned out, was able to kill literally dozens of women before law enforcement even began investigating his murders with any purpose, because he killed almost exclusively prostitutes. Women of ill repute in society's eyes who any upstanding member of society would never miss, until one of the girls turned out to be the runaway daughter of a U.S. senator. Then, the hunt was on and the monster was caught and brought to justice. As of this writing, Ridgway, the Green River Killer, is serving out his life sentence in prison in Walla Walla, Washington. Should this literary work stand the test of time, perhaps now as you read this or listen to it, Ridgway is long dead. Wow, talk about a back to the future moment. In our community, when people would whisper about our serial killer, it was the NPR killer they spoke of, and his name had nothing to do with radio. Like Ridgway, we'd named our killer, like at least one Baptist church, after the river that flowed through our small Appalachian American community, the North Branch of the Potomac River. It might have been an excellent stream for native brook trout fishing, but it was too much of a mouthful to say every time you mentioned the serial killer by name, so we hyphenated it. We took the B out, well, because it flowed better without it. No pun intended. We believed our NPR killer shared more with the Green River killer than just the commonality of having a waterway flowing through their respective communities, after which, respectively, both would be named. We believe the reason that nothing was being done as far as law enforcement taking the killings, if that indeed is what they were, seriously in our part of the world was because no upstanding members of society cared about who had been killed. Sure, two were just in their late 30s, the prime of their lives, as both of the Baptist preachers who oversaw the two different funerals said during their eulogies, and one, though older, was still pretty healthy from living in the light of the Lamb of the Lord our God, as the priest who oversaw his funeral said. But upstanding members of our community, they were not. The first to go was Ricky Clemens, a lifelong troublemaker and former bully. Clemens had been notorious all through his school years for having a penchant for just randomly starting fistfights with whomever was around at the time he felt like he wanted to fight, which was damn near every day. Today, at least in more economically prosperous areas in Appalachia, a kid like that would certainly be expelled and more than likely sent off to some sort of institution where they could get the much needed help they obviously needed. In Appalachia, back then, as I'm sure not too differently now, such behavior, though certainly deemed as undesirable, in most cases wasn't and probably still isn't deemed as inappropriate to any great degree. Any schoolmates of a modern-day Ricky Clemens type would just be expected to be tough and be prepared and defend themselves if they were his next target. That was the case, at least for Clemens' peers, back in the 60s and 70s when he'd been a young terror. I use the term former bully, however, for Clemens because at the time of his death, he was 38 years old and he'd aged out or burned out or whatever it is bullies do when they reach the point in life when youth and natural-born physical prowess gives way to the toll of abuse from years of smoking, and not just cigarettes, drinking, drugging, and living a sedentary lifestyle. These things take a toll on the body, and too much of a toll had been taken on Clemens' body by the time he was 35, evidenced by the fact that when he'd picked his last bar fight with the guy who'd graduated from high school just the year before, and who'd graduated as his class valedictorian, and who had been captain of and the sole member of the chess team, yes, he was a nerd, the guy wiped the floor with Clemens' ass. Clemens stopped picking fights after that embarrassment, and he stopped going to the bar, the only one in town. He stuck to drinking at home alone mostly, and usually while he worked on cars. He'd been a hell of a Votech student, and he'd landed a mechanics job after quitting high school his senior year after he'd gotten news he wasn't going to graduate because he was failing English 12, basically because he couldn't read or write. But he'd lost the job only after a few short years of having it. He was fired due to excessive drinking on the job. So, for the years leading up to his accidental death, as it was being called, he day drank all day, fixed people's cars for 50 cents on the dollar compared to what they'd pay down at the fixing station, and that's literally what it was called. And, it was rumored, bullied his wife and kids. His kids were known for long stretches of absences at school. It was rumored as well that this was to give noticeable bruises time to heal because, well, let's just say the Clemens residence was a regular stop for CPS. Clemens was found crushed underneath a Ford F-250 the first week of November of that year, the year of the NPR murders. He'd been putting on a new front axle for one of his cousins. His cousin wanted to make sure the truck was fixed in time for the upcoming deer season, and he'd been pressuring Clemens to do the job because he'd had the truck since midsummer and hadn't even started the work, and that's why, according to the police report, he'd been haphazard in setting the jack so inappropriately and unsafely. That, plus the 12-pack of Old Milwaukee he'd consumed before starting the job. Sure, the police report said the jack had slipped, allowing the truck to fall on top of and crush Clemens to death, but everyone in town knew that jack could have been pushed over by someone. And though only a few people thought it was, half the town was thinking it by the time the second accidental death occurred, only 2 weeks later. Sarah Bennett had been a real looker in her youth. She was never a cheerleader or a majorette in the band, but certainly not because her looks held her back, rather because she prided herself on being a good old-fashioned hillbilly tomboy. She grew up with 3 brothers, all of whom, by the way, Ricky Clemens never had the balls to tussle with, and they treated her like one of the boys. Growing up, there were many busted lips and noses received by boys looking at her a little too long or trying to grab her in places her bathing suit covered. Sarah was, however, voted homecoming queen her senior year. She'd been pissed when a fellow student had nominated her, and she gave that guy a right good thrashing in the parking lot after school that day, but she was surprisingly flattered when she'd won. The entire student body was excited to see just how good she'd look in a dress come homecoming night, and she'd never worn a dress in her life, but when she showed up in blue jeans, a checkered flannel shirt, and a camouflage hunting jacket, no one was surprised. Many folks who'd fantasized about seeing Sarah dressing up nice would have their fantasies fulfilled just a year or two after she graduated from high school. Many more would have much darker fantasies than that fulfilled as well, for you see, things didn't quite work out as well for Sarah Bennett after high school. Didn't work out so well. No one realized that when she'd walked across the stage to receive her high school diploma in June of 1973, the first one in her family to ever do so, she wasn't alone. She was with child. She was 3 months pregnant with what would become her daughter, Sissy, born later in December of that year. No one knew who the father was, and no one dared speculate because a couple of people had, and they ended up with busted lips and noses in some parking lot somewhere or other in our small town. Sarah found herself a single mom, and her attitude and temper found her to be unemployable. Sure, she'd been given a chance down at the local Five and Dime, but when a customer complained about some little old nothing and Sarah whipped her ass in response to her complaint, Sarah was summarily fired and no one in town would hire her after that. Sarah turned to prostitution. Yes, even tiny little Appalachian American towns like ours had prostitutes. It was all hush-hush, but everyone knew. And seeing how Sarah was so fine and sexy, she had no problem getting Johns. In time, however, she would turn to drugs as well, and when she decided to try heroin, Sarah got hooked. It wasn't long before Sarah couldn't sell her wares, so to say. She'd completely wrecked herself with the heroin, and when you looked at her, you saw what appeared to be a mid-50s-year-old hag, not a woman who'd just entered her 30s and who'd been homecoming queen barely more than a decade before. Rumor was she'd turned to pimping out her 12-year-old daughter, Sissy, in order to make ends meet. Just as people started talking about the need to get Sissy away from her mother, just in case the rumors were true, there came no need to worry about CPS stepping in to do so, as Sissy's mother, Sarah, ended up having a fatal accident. Accidentally. At least that's what they called it. Sarah had gone over to Ricky Clemens' garage about 2 weeks after Clemens had had his so-called accident. She'd taken her old beater of a car over and dropped it off a week or so before his unfortunate demise because it needed some work done. Seeing how the work was never going to get done, at least by Clemens, as he was no longer among the living, Sarah walked over one day and took the car. Just as she headed over the steep knoll, beginning her descent back down the very steep hollow she'd had to walk up to retrieve her car. Remember, this is all taking place in West by God, Virginia. She realized her brakes were out. There was no slowing or stopping, and being that the descent was more than a mile long, she'd managed to work up to a speed of 78 miles per hour by the time she reached the bottom, where a fully loaded timber truck was coming from the other direction, traveling at 35 miles an hour. Mass plus force plus whatever else the college-educated investigators who showed up on the scene later said, all ended up equaling one dead prostitute who'd been rumored to be pimping out her 12-year-old daughter to make ends meet. The police report said no inspection of the vehicle Sarah had been driving was necessary, as obviously she'd taken it to Clemens to have the brakes fixed, and they clearly had never been fixed. Case closed. They had no idea she'd only put it in the shop because the headlights needed to be replaced. The brakes were fine. 2 weeks after that, a different person, having led a different yet similar life of ill repute, met the same fate. Their unfortunate demise by way of a fatal accident. At least that's what they wanted us to believe. But by this point, we all knew it was the NPR killer. Mel Moretti was a loan shark. At least that was his unofficial title. He fancied himself a landlord, and he did own quite a few properties around our small Appalachian American town. 2 trailer lots and several dilapidated clapboard-sided houses built back during the last coal boom, more than half a century before the time we're discussing here, which meant that more aptly described than a landlord, Mel Moretti was a slumlord. Mel had come to our small community long before I'd been born. It was the early 50s and America was experiencing its greatest economic boom since the roaring 20s. The Second World War had ended the decade before and there was prosperity everywhere, even in Appalachia. But things weren't necessarily going so well for the Appalachian Americans who lived there. You see, the coal mines that were doing so well in West by God, Virginia, were owned by out-of-state interests, mostly trust fund baby millionaires and billionaires from Pennsylvania and New York. The only part of the prosperity that was going on around in Appalachia that any of us hillbillies could hope for was a decent paying job in one of the mines. But even if you got one of those well-paying jobs, it came with a lackluster benefit no one wanted. A future date with premature death at the hands of black lung, and that only if the mines caving in didn't kill you first. But then came Mel Moretti, a good-looking, quick-talking, slicked-back, jet-black-haired man of Italian descent from New York. Or was it New Jersey? Or was it neither? You see, Moretti never told the same story the same way twice, especially if it pertained to himself and or money, which, by the way, were the only two things Moretti ever cared to talk about. Most folks figured he'd been caught up in some mafia activity gone bad and that he'd defected to the best hiding spot in the modern world, Appalachia. And when he began offering loans so that folks could pursue their passions and leave the mines, folks stopped caring about where he came from and what his past might be. Mel was granting personal loans for people to start or buy businesses and even buy houses, loans that people couldn't get from the bank because they didn't qualify. So Mel was a swell guy. Until he wasn't. You see, Mel, in exchange for currency, when currency could not be used for payment, would accept favors instead. Mel had a sadistic hunger in him, and he used people who couldn't make payments on the personal loans he's extended them to feed that hunger. There had been a neighbor of Mel's who caused him problems from the beginning. I'll never settle for no derogatory term. This is social media, so I can't say it, but it's in the book. Living by me, by God, Eddie Jacobson would scream often, and from the beginning of the time Mel bought the place next to Jacobson's, who merely began flying a Confederate flag where their property lines met, though Moretti nor anyone else could figure out what the purpose behind it was. The Italians were never held as enslaved people in the South, and technically, our part of Appalachistan had fought on the side of the North, but whatever. Jacobson would regularly play extremely loud music, aiming the speakers of his stereo system while doing so directly at Moretti's house. Jacobson procured a dozen loudly barking coonhounds, whose shit smelled to high heavens and was never cleaned, and put them in a kennel placed just beneath the Confederate flag on the property line. Jacobson then put in a new outdoor fire pit, placed only far enough away from the kennel to keep the dogs from catching on fire, but close enough to Moretti's house for his house to constantly be encased in a cloud of smoke, created by the burning of brush, leaves, and garbage, whether it was during government-approved burning periods or not. Peter Higgins used to hunt with Eddie Jacobson. He was also the first person not able to make good on his payments to Mel Moretti. He'd borrowed enough money for the down payment of a home, and then he'd gotten the actual mortgage for the rest from the bank. After getting 3 months behind on his payments to Moretti, Moretti had a very private meeting with him, and the following day, Higgins and Jacobson went hunting, and only Higgins came back. For Higgins had accidentally shot and killed Jacobson, having mistaken him for a deer. Yeah, right. Higgins had been best good friends with the sheriff back in high school. They'd played on the first football team from our school to make it to the state playoffs. So Higgins was taken at his word and no investigation was carried out. Jacobson had been divorced. His adult daughter inherited his house, but she didn't want it. Moretti bought it from her for pennies on the dollar and used it as his first of what would become many rental properties. Oh, and no, he did not clean up the mess to include all the dogs and their shit before renting it out. 3 different families who instinctively started taking care of the coon dogs once they moved in would rent the house over a number of years before the last of those 12 dogs finally died. There would be others who would get behind on their payments to Moretti throughout the years, and strangely, someone they knew, who Moretti didn't like, would end up having some sort of accident of their own. They didn't always die, actually only a few of them did, but they would be injured painfully and extensively enough to realize that Mel Moretti was not to be messed with, and somehow, almost magically, the payments to Moretti would finally begin being made. Fast forward to the mid-1980s. No one messed with Mel Moretti by then. However, at some point, some say it happened in the 70s, Moretti became a little too big for his britches and began making demands of people who were making their payments. Hell, he even started making demands of people who didn't even owe him money. Everyone learned, however, to meet his demands or they would end up being visited by someone they knew, but that they didn't know owed Moretti money. And, well, what Mel Moretti wanted from the poor people of our tiny little Appalachian American town, Mel Moretti got. Disgustingly, Mel Moretti liked children. Mel Moretti was found dead just 2 weeks before our night in question, here with me at the Catholic Church in the confessional booth, the night I write of now, the night of my altar boy's confession when I was touched in a very terrifying way by the priest of our parish. Mel Moretti liked to park his old sedan across the street from the local daycare center. There was a church with a parking lot there, the First Baptist Church of whatever street it was on, I'm sure, and the parking lot was always empty during the week. If one were to pass by, they'd not even notice Moretti's car in most cases. However, if one were to notice the car and they knew about Moretti, they would know that Mel Moretti was sitting in his car observing children. Again. It was in his car across the street from the daycare in the church parking lot where the police found Mel Moretti's dead body. The pastor of the church had called and reported the body. It was a Wednesday, and the pastor had arrived at the church just after dark to prepare for the Wednesday evening service when he spotted Moretti's car. At first, and though he'd never tell this to the police, the pastor was worried because he was behind on his payments to Moretti. As he walked over to Moretti's car, he was fully prepared to tell Moretti that he'd come to the church to go inside and take money from the offering account to make his payment, just as he'd done so many times before. However, when the pastor got to Moretti's car, he realized Moretti was dead inside. There was a hose duct taped to Moretti's mouth. His nose had been duct taped closed. The hose came out of the window, which was rolled up as far as it could be without crushing or pinching the hose, and it led to the exhaust pipe. Suicide is what the sheriff said the moment he arrived. It's obvious, he said, and no further investigation was carried out. Everyone in town knew Moretti's death had the NPR killer's signature all over it. For one thing, Moretti's car had not been running, and not because it had run out of gas. It had half a tank in it. Jason Brown's uncle, who owns a tow company and who towed the car away, said so afterward. And no mention was ever made in any police report of the strangulation marks around Moretti's neck. Billy Everson's dad is a local mortician, and he told everyone he saw the marks and that they were consistent with the strangling. And everyone knew better than to speak of the fact that the sheriff himself owed Moretti more than $100,000, and this was a hell of a lot more money back in the mid-1980s than it is now, due to a gambling addiction. When the sheriff wasn't on duty, you could find him over on one of the casino boats on the Ohio River, or at one of the dog tracks along the banks over on the Ohio side of the river, or up in Charlestown where there were plenty of betting tracks. No one wanted to be on the sheriff's bad side, that whole backwoods justice thing, you know, so all these facts were ignored. Alas, I digress with details behind Moretti's death, but it is now time to get to the point and flash back to the very night of my confession. Since we had a killer on the loose, my mind was a bit occupied as I cleaned up after our Christmas pageant that night at the Roman Catholic Church. I'd had parts here and there in the play that wasn't really a play, more of a Christmassy mass, but mostly I'd served as one of the altar boys throughout. I'd been an altar boy for nearly a year by this time, but I was actually getting ready to lose my job. Volunteer position, rather. Strike that, voluntold by my mother, as it was. You see, I refused to make my first confession, one of the 7 sacraments required to get into heaven as viewed by the Catholic Church, because, again, my gun and Bible-toting Earth Father would not allow it. What's the big deal? I actually said aloud, my cleaning duties complete. I was about to make my way over to the rectory and join the afterplay party. I was walking past the confessional booth and thought of the act of confession, and the thought of the act of confession crossed my mind, erasing the thoughts I'd been having of the NPR killer. I walked over to the confessional booth. Both sides were empty, their curtains open. Almost instinctively, I stepped into the booth. However, I did not step inside on the side of the sinner. I entered the side of the priest. I was curious as to why his side was so much more comfortable. I guess as I'd learned later during my brief military career, rank has its privileges. I'd shut the curtain and was just sitting there in silence when I heard the front doors of the church open and then shut. I sat silently, wondering how I was going to escape the confessional booth unseen. As I sat, I listened. I soon picked up on the sound of footsteps, and they were coming my way. I peeked out of the slit in the curtain, and I saw the priest, Father Moran, coming straight for the confessional booth. Oh, great, I thought. He's going to find me when he opens the curtain. He's no doubt coming so that people could come make confessions as they were leaving the party next door. However, he did not open the curtain upon reaching the confessional booth. Rather, he got in on the other side, sat, and then closed the curtain. Next, he spoke, saying, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 2 weeks since my last confession." I sat silently, trying to figure out what was going on. Had he seen me? Did he know I was there? Was this a game he was playing, trying to smoke me out, so to say, rope me into making my first confession? "I've done it again, Father," he said, "and after what had passed as the longest minute of my life, I have killed again." I could hardly hear what Father Moran said next, as my heart was beating so loudly due to the adrenaline and the fear was causing it to pump throughout my body so quickly, but hear it I did. "How can I not, Father?" he said. "Is this not why you called me to the cloth? To put me in a position to find out who commits the gravest of sins so that I can make them pay while protecting the innocent?" I could sense both anger and pain in his voice. He sobbed while he spoke, and after this terrifying opening, he stopped speaking so that he could sob uninterrupted by words. But then, "I have tried to honor you, Father, but you have led me to it. You knew what I was before I took my vows, before seminary. You promised me I would quit if I just gave my life to you and worked in your capacity, not in the capacity of my flesh. But Father, you have led me to the den of thieves. How easy I find those who steal the innocence of youth as they confess to me here, or as others contact me out of concern for the victims. Why, Father, oh, why have you called me to this place of devious duty where I can carry out the same sins I've committed before? Murder, 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 but get by with it without question because I do so while hiding behind the cloth." He stopped speaking again and sobbed even harder. He sobbed for minutes. He mumbled something here and there between sobs, all incoherent by this point, and then finally resorted to only sobbing. I must have sat in that booth for 30 minutes, the entire time knowing that if he were to ever hear me breathe, he would come over to my side of the booth, and I would then no doubt be the next victim of the NPR killer. He would be forced to murder me, not because of anything I'd done, but because I knew what he had. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Father Moran, the NPR killer, left the confessional booth. By God's grace, and I'm convinced just dumb luck, he never came to my side of the booth. Once he'd left the church, I was watching through the slit in the curtains, I made a run for it, making sure to exit out the back door of the church. I ran and ran until I reached the back door of the rectory. Just as I made my way inside, closing the door behind me, I saw Father Moran come through the front door. He never even noticed me as he immediately went about talking up those at the party. I didn't sleep a wink that night after what I'd heard. What was I to do? Should I go to the police? Should I tell my parents? No on both, I thought. Everyone, even we children, knew the police were corrupt, and my parents were assholes. They'd never believe me, they'd just beat me. I knew not to talk to any teachers because they'd call my parents and then my parents would beat me. So I did what any kid in my position would do. Nothing. I didn't have to live with my conscience long, for shortly after the new year, Father Moran was transferred to another parish. We got a new priest, Father Rogers, who, by no stretch of anyone's imagination, could have harmed anyone. The man was in his 80s, and my fellow altar boys and myself spent most of our time studying him during the Mass service, when he'd faltered, nearly falling down at times. That and waking him up, he'd fall asleep during the parishioner reading parts of the Mass. I never did know where Father Moran went. I never followed him throughout his career. There was no Google in the mid-'80s. Hell, there wasn't even an internet. Father Moran had been a young priest when he did his time in our part of Appalachistan, just in his early 30s. He was healthy, vigorous, known throughout our town as a jock, as he was always seen taking his morning runs, and he loved to stop by the local schools and play pickup basketball games with anyone on the courts. No one could keep up with him. My purpose behind pointing out his fitness and health is to give credibility to my gut feeling that he's probably alive and well somewhere. As of this writing, he would be in his 80s, yes, but probably, if he kept up with his lifestyle, still running 5K and 10K road races despite his age. I have no idea if he's still a priest or not. One thing I do know for sure is that if my hunch is correct, and he is still alive and well, the NPR killer is still out there. The end. I hope you enjoyed that story. Again, it's one of several, most of them Christmas themed, of my new release, Utopia Shattered. It's available on Amazon in both print and Kindle. But back to the reason I read this story and the conversation we started with. Feel free to comment away in the comment section in regard to your beliefs, how you feel I might have that difficult conversation with my son. I promise you, unless you're disrespectful to me, my family, or other commenters, you will not be banned. Your comments will not be removed, despite your views. Let's just all try to get along and come together and have a conversation, because this is just a father asking for help, trying not to make the same mistakes that were made, as I see it, in my own upbringing in regards to religion, God, faith, Jesus, all these things. Thanks for being here with me for another video on the greatest homesteading channel on the planet that typically doesn't have a thing to do with homesteading off the grid. See you for more next time. Again, pray for my buddy Jonathan and pray for Lolo, and grant me some guidance and wisdom in regard to my son.